unknown numbers. Call. Emily sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the steady hum of her laptop the only sound breaking the silence. It was late, and most of her friends were already asleep, leaving her to finish the last chapter of her work on an old manuscript. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly, and she glanced at the screen. An unknown number flashed, its digits unfamiliar. Curiosity piqued. Emily hesitated only a moment before answering. Hello? A chilling silence answered her, followed by a muffled, almost indistinguishable whisper. It was as if the voice was trying to speak through a barrier. Emily's skin prickled, but she shook off the unease and ended the call. She tried to focus on her work, but her concentration was broken. Minutes later, the phone buzzed again. It was the same unknown number. This time, she let it go to voicemail, but her anxiety grew as she heard the phone ring again and again. Emily finally picked up. Hello? The voice on the other end was clearer now, though still strained. Emily, you need to listen. They're coming for you. Before she could respond, the call ended abruptly. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She glanced around her apartment, suddenly feeling the weight of her solitude more acutely. Her phone buzzed once more, but this time she didn't answer. Instead, she turned it off, hoping the silence would bring some comfort. Sleep was elusive. Every creak and groan of the apartment seemed magnified in the dead of night. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. She eventually drifted off, but it wasn't long before the sound of her phone ringing woke her with a jolt. The screen glowed with the same unknown number. Heart pounding, Emily answered. Who is this? The voice was frantic now. You need to get out. They're already inside. The line went dead, and Emily's pulse quickened. She fumbled with her phone and saw a notification from her security camera app. The small camera she'd installed at her front door had detected movement. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen anyone come in. The door was locked. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing unusual. Still, the sense of dread was undeniable. She checked the security feed on her laptop, and for a moment, the screen was dark. Then it flickered to life, showing the hallway outside her apartment. Everything appeared normal. Emily decided to check her locks and make sure everything was secure. As she moved through her apartment, her phone buzzed again, a new unknown number this time. She answered with a shaky voice. Yes? Emily, the voice whispered. They're getting closer. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything out of place. The apartment seemed unchanged. She disconnected the call and decided to call the police, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. As the phone rang, she heard a soft, echoing knock at her door. Emily's heart raced, and she hesitated before slowly approaching. Who is it? She called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The knocking grew more insistent. She looked through the peephole again, but saw nothing. She checked the security feed and saw nothing unusual. Deciding it was best to stay calm, Emily continued with her call to the police, but her voice broke as she tried to explain the situation. Please hurry, she begged. Someone's at my door, and I don't know who they are. The officer on the other end promised to send someone immediately. Emily hung up, but the knocking continued, now accompanied by a low, eerie scratching sound. It was as though someone was trying to force their way in. Suddenly, her phone rang again. The number was familiar, but the voice on the other end was distorted, almost robotic. Emily, you have to hide. They're coming for you. Emily's eyes darted around the apartment. She couldn't stay here. She grabbed her keys and was about to leave when the lights flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled around, trying to find her way to the exit. Her phone buzzed once more. With trembling hands, she turned it on. A text message appeared on the screen from the same unknown number. They're already inside. Emily froze. She glanced around, her breathing ragged. The scratching sound had stopped. Instead, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps moving through her apartment. She ducked behind the couch, her heart pounding in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She could hear them coming down the hall towards the living room. Emily held her breath, clutching her phone tightly. The apartment was eerily quiet now, and then she heard a whisper right next to her ear. Emily! The voice was unmistakable. It was her own voice, but distorted and sinister. She turned slowly, her phone screen lighting up her face. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw her own reflection in the screen, a reflection that wasn't her own. It was an image of herself, but twisted and malevolent. In a frenzied panic, Emily scrambled to her feet and rushed to the door. She flung it open and stumbled into the hallway, only to come face to face with a police officer. Relief washed over her, but as she turned back, she saw her apartment door close behind her on its own. The officer looked at her with confusion. "Are you all right? We got your call." Emily nodded, still shaking. "Yes, but I need to get back inside. I saw..." The officer's expression changed from confusion to one of concern. "What did you see?" Before she could answer, the door to her apartment creaked open again. Emily and the officer stepped inside, but the apartment was empty. The lights flickered back on, revealing nothing out of place. Emily's phone buzzed one last time. She looked at the screen and saw a new message from the same unknown number. "The call is coming from inside the house." Emily's heart sank as the officer's radio crackled to life. "Unit 23, we have a situation. Your partner," the one who answered the call, "he didn't make it." Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the true horror. The voice she had been hearing was her own, distorted by something or someone she couldn't see. The unknown numbers were not a warning, but a chilling prelude to a deeper, more personal horror.
Story number 2.
Footsteps without echo. The small town of Ravensbrook was cloaked in silence when Alice arrived. It was the kind of silence that made you uncomfortable, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The local inn, an aging structure with ivy creeping up its walls, was where Alice would spend her first night. Her mother's house, a crumbling mansion at the end of Raven Lane, had been left to her in the will. Alice had grown up hearing tales of the mansion's strange occurrences, but she hadn't believed them until now. As she checked in, the innkeeper, an elderly woman with a somber face, handed her a brass key with a shaky hand. "Do you know how to get to the house?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alice nodded. "I think so. It's just down Raven Lane." The woman hesitated, her gaze shifting nervously. "Be cautious. Ravensbrook has a way of keeping its own secrets." Alice smiled politely and took her leave. The mansion loomed ahead as she drove down the overgrown road. It looked more menacing in the dark, with its sagging roof and broken windows. She parked the car and walked up the creaky steps, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. Inside, the mansion was as she remembered it, dusty, neglected, but still majestic. The large foyer was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through cracked windows. Alice set down her suitcase and began exploring, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She felt a chill and decided to check the old grandfather clock in the corner. It had stopped at midnight, its hands frozen in time. The wind howled outside, causing the old house to groan. Alice was about to head upstairs when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. She paused, straining to hear. It was coming from the second floor, just above her. Her curiosity overcame her, and she climbed the staircase, each step creaking under her weight. The hallway was lined with portraits of her ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The tapping grew louder as she approached the end of the corridor. She opened the door to the master bedroom, where the sound was most pronounced. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight that illuminated a large, ornate mirror on the far wall. Alice noticed that the tapping sound was coming from within the mirror. She approached it slowly, her reflection growing larger with each step. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned in closer. Suddenly she heard it, a soft, uneven tapping behind her. Alice spun around, but the room was empty. The tapping continued, but it seemed to be moving. She followed the sound to a wardrobe in the corner. The tapping grew frantic as she opened the wardrobe, revealing only moth-eaten clothes and a forgotten hat box. The noise stopped abruptly. Alice stood still, her ears straining to catch any hint of sound. She was about to turn away when she noticed something odd. A thin layer of dust on the wardrobe floor had been disturbed, forming a trail leading to a hidden door behind the wardrobe. Her hands shook as she opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. The steps creaked loudly as she descended into the darkness. At the bottom, she found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The only light came from a single candle flickering on an old wooden table. On the table lay an old journal with a lock. Alice picked it up, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal. The journal contained sketches and notes about the mansion's history. Strange symbols, eerie drawings of figures lurking in the shadows. But the most unsettling entry was dated over 100 years ago and described footsteps that would follow a person, growing louder and louder until they were driven mad. Alice's heart raced as she read. The last entry was a frantic scrawl. "They are here. I hear their footsteps, but they never echo." As she closed the journal, she heard it again. The tapping, now a steady rhythmic pattern. It was coming from all around her. Alice's pulse quickened. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She spun around, but the room was empty. The tapping grew louder, louder, until it was deafening. The floor beneath her seemed to tremble. She tried to run, but her legs felt like lead. The tapping was relentless, closing in on her. She reached the staircase and scrambled up, but the sound followed her, getting closer with every step. Her breaths came in short gasps as she burst into the master bedroom, slamming the door behind her. The room was silent once more, save for her own ragged breathing. She glanced at the mirror again. Her reflection looked back at her, but something was different. The figure in the mirror wasn't her. It was a shadowy, indistinct shape. Panic surged through her. She turned away from the mirror and backed toward the window. The tapping resumed, but now it was outside, coming from below. It was as if someone or something was trying to get in. She looked out the window and saw nothing but darkness. Then she noticed a figure standing in the distance, its shape obscured by the gloom. Alice squinted, trying to make out any details. The figure began to move toward her, its footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Just as she was about to scream, the figure stepped into the moonlight. It was her own doppelganger, a perfect replica of herself, but with a twisted, malevolent grin. The doppelganger raised its hand, pointing to the mirror. Alice turned to see her own reflection slowly moving on its own, eyes wide and pleading. A chilling realization washed over her. Her own reflection was alive and trying to escape. It was not the footsteps, but the mirror itself that had been seeking her. She grabbed the journal and threw it at the mirror, shattering it into pieces. The room fell silent once more. Alice was left alone, with only the broken shards of the mirror scattered around her. She left the mansion as dawn broke, her mind racing with the horrors she had witnessed. As she drove away, she glanced back at the mansion one last time. She saw a figure standing in the window, her own face staring back at her with that same malevolent grin. The mansion had claimed her reflection, and now it was waiting for its next visitor. Alice sped away, knowing she would never return. The footsteps without echo had finally found their new home in the shattered mirror, and Ravensbrook would keep its dark secrets for another day.
Story number 3.
Elevator never stops. At the heart of the city stood the Sterling Tower, a colossal edifice of glass and steel. It was a marvel of modern engineering, boasting luxurious apartments and high-end offices. Its most peculiar feature, however, was its elevator system. The elevator was said to be the fastest in the world, whisking occupants up and down with a swiftness that seemed almost unnatural. Mara Thompson, a young journalist, had recently moved into one of the tower's higher floors. Her new apartment was pristine, boasting a view of the sprawling cityscape that stretched endlessly into the horizon. Yet, it was the elevator that intrigued her most. She'd heard rumors about it, strange stories and hushed warnings from the building's staff. One evening, as Mara prepared to go out for a late dinner, she noticed the elevator doors open by themselves. The light inside was dim, almost inviting. Her curiosity piqued, she stepped inside. The moment she did, the doors slid shut behind her, and the elevator began its descent. Mara glanced at the floor indicator. It seemed to be moving at an alarming speed. Seconds later, the elevator stopped with a jarring thud. The display showed the floor as Nash 1. This was odd. There were no floors below the building's basement. The doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the air was thick with dust. Mara hesitated, but decided to investigate. She stepped out, her footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The corridor twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the building's bowels. Every so often, the overhead lights flickered ominously. Mara's heart raced as she realized she was venturing into a part of the building that seemed almost forgotten. Finally, she reached a large steel door marked with a faded emblem. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pushed the door open. Inside, she found a room filled with old machinery and control panels. It was clear this was the elevator's control room, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. A dusty logbook lay on a table in the center of the room. Mara picked it up and flipped through its pages. The entries were mostly illegible, but one stood out. "We have tried to stop it, but it will not be stopped. It has its own mind now, its own will. It never stops." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a peculiar sight. An old, rusted lever labeled Override. Next to it was a panel with a single button labeled Emergency Stop. Mara approached the panel, her hands trembling. She hesitated, then pressed the button. The elevator's descent abruptly halted, and the corridor outside fell into an eerie silence. Relieved, Mara made her way back to the elevator. So, the doors slid open as she approached, and she stepped inside, expecting to return to her apartment. But as soon as the doors closed, the elevator began moving again. This time, upwards. The speed was unnerving. The elevator shot up through the building, passing floors at a dizzying pace. Mara desperately pressed the stop button, but nothing happened. The indicator showed floor after floor, but they all seemed to blend together in a blur. Suddenly, the elevator lurched to a halt, and the lights flickered out. Panic surged through Mara as she groped in the darkness. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The elevator jolted and resumed its ascent, the lights flickering back on. When the elevator finally came to a stop, the doors opened to reveal not her apartment floor, but an entirely unfamiliar one. The hallway outside was decorated in a style reminiscent of the early 1900s, complete with ornate wallpaper and antique furniture. Mara stepped out, her heart pounding. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out in both directions. Her only choice was to move forward. As she walked, she noticed the paintings on the walls depicted the tower's construction through various stages, but each one showed the building progressively sinking into a dark abyss. She rounded a corner and found herself in a large, opulent lobby, its grandeur marred by the thick layers of dust. At the far end of the room was a large, ornate mirror. Mara approached it cautiously and was taken aback by what she saw. The reflection showed her standing alone, but behind her, the shadowy figures of people in old-fashioned attire loomed, their faces twisted in silent screams. A chill ran down her spine as she spun around, but there was no one there. She turned back to the mirror, and the figures had disappeared. Mara's reflection seemed to warp and distort, her own face becoming unrecognizable. In a moment of sheer terror, she realized the building's floors were trapped in a perpetual loop of time, its occupants forever lost in a cycle of endless, unchanging suffering. Desperate to escape, Mara ran back to the elevator. She frantically pressed the emergency stop button, but the elevator remained motionless, its doors stubbornly closed. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Mara's hope dwindled as she slumped against the wall. The elevator's lights flickered once more, and an oppressive silence enveloped her. Just as she thought all was lost, the elevator jolted and began its descent once more, stopping with a thud. The doors slid open to reveal her apartment floor. The familiar surroundings seemed almost surreal after her harrowing ordeal. Mara stepped out, her heart still racing. She glanced back at the elevator as the doors slid shut behind her. The floor indicator showed Niche 1 once more before the elevator disappeared from view. Later that night, Mara's curiosity got the better of her, and she returned to the control room. She opened the logbook and noticed a new entry. "It has taken one more. It never stops." Mara's blood ran cold as she realized the chilling truth. The elevator was not just a machine, but a sentient entity, feeding on the souls of those who dared to challenge it, and now it had claimed her. As she left the control room, the elevator's lights flickered ominously. She knew that the next time she entered, it might not let her out. And as she descended into her apartment, she could only hope that the elevator never stopped. The Sterling Tower remained a towering enigma, its elevator forever in motion, a silent testament to the lost souls trapped within its walls.
Story number 4.
The old mansion on the hill had been abandoned for decades, its paint peeling and its windows darkened by time. Most locals avoided it, whispering tales of its haunted past. But for Julia, the dilapidated house was an opportunity for something much more tangible, her next big story. As a journalist with a penchant for the macabre, she saw it as a chance to revive her stagnant career. Julia parked her car at the base of the hill and walked up the overgrown path, her flashlight cutting through the dense fog. The mansion loomed above her, its once grand facade now an eerie silhouette. With a deep breath, she pushed open the creaky front door and stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of mold and neglect. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way through the grand foyer, the high ceilings and crumbling wallpaper whispering secrets of a forgotten era. Julia's flashlight beam flickered over dusty furniture draped in white sheets, creating ghostly shapes in the dim light. She began her exploration on the ground floor, documenting every detail with her camera. There were the typical signs of decay: water stains on the ceiling, cobwebs in the corners, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. Yet Julia's excitement grew with each step. This was perfect material for her story. As she moved deeper into the house, she noticed a grand staircase leading to the upper floors. She hesitated only momentarily before ascending, the wooden steps groaning under her weight. At the top, she found a long hallway with several doors. One door, slightly ajar, caught her attention. It led to a room bathed in the dim, yellow light of her flashlight. The room was oddly pristine compared to the rest of the house, with clean floors and furniture that seemed untouched by time. An old-fashioned bed, neatly made, stood against one wall, its white curtains swaying gently despite the lack of wind. Julia's curiosity was piqued. This room was too perfect, too out of place. She approached the bed and noticed an old photograph lying on the nightstand. It was a faded picture of a family, 2 adults and a child, smiling at the camera. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note. "Remember me, for I am always here." A chill ran down Julia's spine. She turned away from the bed, feeling an inexplicable sense of being watched. The curtains continued to sway as if moved by an unseen hand. She shook off the feeling and decided to explore the rest of the house. Julia spent hours searching through the mansion, uncovering remnants of its past, old letters, dusty books, and forgotten trinkets. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The house seemed to come alive with strange noises, the whisper of a breeze through cracked windows, the distant thud of something falling, and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Finally, she decided to head back to the room with the bed. But when she arrived, she was stunned to find that the room had changed. The bed was no longer made. The curtains were drawn tightly shut. The photograph and note had vanished. Julia felt a surge of anxiety. Had she imagined the whole thing? Just then, she heard a soft, rhythmic sound from behind the curtains. She approached them cautiously, her heart pounding. With a trembling hand, she pulled the curtains open. The room was now illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp, revealing a young girl sitting on the bed, her back to Julia. She wore a vintage dress and had her head bowed, her dark hair obscuring her face. Julia's breath caught in her throat. "Hello," she called softly, but the girl did not respond. Julia took a step closer, her hand reaching out. "Are you okay?" The girl slowly turned her head, revealing a face that was both pale and eerily serene. Her eyes, however, were hollow, as if something vital had been drained from them. Julia's instinct was to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot. The girl began to speak in a soft, mournful tone. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. "This place is cursed." The words chilled Julia to the bone. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The family in the photograph," the girl continued. "They were trapped here, bound by a curse. They can never leave, and neither can I. Now you are part of it too." Julia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the girl's words. The room began to spin, and she felt a growing pressure in her chest. Panic set in as she realized she had been lured into a trap. Desperate to escape, Julia turned to leave, but the door was no longer where it should have been. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder. She pounded on the walls, shouting for help, but her cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence. The girl's voice echoed in her mind. "Remember me, for I am always here." In her final moments, Julia understood the twisted truth. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, and she had become another trapped soul. As the darkness consumed her, Julia felt the cold, hollow eyes of the girl watching her, a reminder that some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. The mansion on the hill remained as it always had, its eerie silence a testament to the souls trapped within, and the curtains in the room on the upper floor swayed slow, as if mourning the loss of yet another victim who had dared to uncover its secrets.
Story number 5.
Eyes in fog. The small town of Dunbridge sat shrouded in fog, a thick, suffocating blanket that rolled in every evening without fail. It had been this way for years, an unspoken curse hanging over the town like a dark omen. The locals were used to it, but newcomers never stayed long. They'd whisper about the eerie, unending mist and the strange things that happened within it, but most of them left before they could experience anything for themselves. Emma, a journalist with a penchant for the peculiar, had come to Dunbridge seeking a story. She was skeptical of the rumors, but intrigued by the town's isolation and the mystery that seemed to cling to its every corner. Her curiosity was piqued by the stories of people disappearing in the fog, swallowed by the heavy mist, as though it had a mind of its own. The old library was the only place in town where Emma could find records and perhaps a clue to the town's strange reputation. Inside, the air was stale with dust and age, and the only light came from a flickering overhead bulb. Emma rifled through the old newspapers and faded journals, her eyes scanning for anything that might explain the fog's persistent presence. As she read through articles dating back to the early 1900s, a pattern began to emerge. Every few years, someone vanished in the fog. The accounts were always the same, people going out for a walk only to never return. There were no bodies, no traces, just the thick, rolling mist. Emma's interest was piqued, and she decided to venture out into the fog herself to see if she could uncover the truth. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma wrapped herself in a heavy coat and stepped outside. The fog had already begun to roll in, swirling around her like a living entity. She shivered, though the air was still. The mist seemed to swallow the streetlights, casting the world into a ghostly gray. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she walked, her breath creating small puffs of vapor in the dense fog. She followed the main road, her steps muffled by the fog. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of an old house settling or the distant hoot of an owl. Emma's flashlight pierced the mist, its beam revealing nothing but endless gray. Her mind raced with theories about the fog. Was it supernatural, or was there a more rational explanation? As she ventured further, she noticed something peculiar. There were shadows moving in the fog, not quite solid, but shifting in ways that seemed almost intentional. Emma's heart began to race, and she quickened her pace. The shadows seemed to follow her, closing in with every step she took. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her, soft, shuffling footsteps. Emma spun around, but the fog was too thick to see anything clearly. She tried to call out, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive mist. Her flashlight flickered, and she fumbled with it, her nerves on edge. The fog thickened around her, and she felt a presence closing in. Panic set in, and she began to run, her footsteps echoing eerily in the mist. The shadows seemed to grow more defined, and Emma could feel their cold breath on her neck. She darted down an alley, hoping to lose them, but the fog was relentless, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. Just as she was about to give up hope, she stumbled upon a small old house. The door was ajar, and she dashed inside, slamming it behind her. The house was dark and musty, but it felt like a refuge from the encroaching fog. Emma leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, her heart pounding. The interior of the house was surprisingly intact, with old furniture covered in white sheets and dusty bookshelves lining the walls. Emma moved cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She noticed a staircase leading to the upper floor and decided to investigate. As she climbed the stairs, she felt a growing sense of unease. The air was colder up there, and she could hear a faint whispering sound. It seemed to come from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. Emma approached the door, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door open. The room was filled with old, faded photographs. They depicted various people, all of whom had the same vacant expression. Emma's eyes widened as she realized that they were all people who had vanished in the fog over the years. Each photograph was dated and labeled with the name of the person. As she examined the photographs, Emma noticed something strange. In each picture, the subjects had a pair of eyes that seemed to follow her. The eyes were unsettling, not just staring but watching with a sense of awareness that made Emma's skin crawl. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. She spun around and, to her horror, saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes, however, were alive with a strange, otherworldly light. Emma tried to speak, but no words came out. The man moved closer, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see right into her soul. She backed away, her heart racing. The man's eyes seemed to draw her in, making her feel as though she was being pulled towards him. With a sudden burst of courage, Emma turned and ran back down the stairs, but the fog had already begun to seep into the house. It swirled around her, thick and impenetrable. She stumbled through the mist, desperately searching for a way out. Just when she thought she was lost for good, she saw a glimmer of light. It was the street lamp outside, barely visible through the fog. Emma pushed through the mist and emerged onto the street, gasping for breath. The fog seemed to be retreating, and the oppressive weight lifted. Emma turned back to look at the house, but it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, as if the house had never existed. Her heart pounded as she realized that she had narrowly escaped whatever had claimed the others. As she walked away, Emma glanced back one last time. For a brief moment, she thought she saw those haunting eyes watching her from the fog. She shivered, knowing that the mist held secrets she might never fully understand. And as the fog rolled back into Dunbridge, it took with it the remnants of the night's terror, leaving only whispers of what had happened within its depths.
Story number 6.
Hair stands up. Emma's old farmhouse stood isolated at the edge of a dense forest, its once bright paint now peeling and gray with age. The house had been in her family for generations, and while it was more of a relic than a home, it held a strange nostalgic charm. Emma had decided to spend the weekend there alone, seeking solitude and a break from the constant buzz of city life. But as soon as she arrived, an uneasy feeling settled over her, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken warnings. The first night passed uneventfully. Emma busied herself with unpacking and setting up her things, trying to ignore the way the wind howled through the cracked windows. Exhausted from her drive, she fell asleep with a book propped open on her chest. Around midnight, Emma was jolted awake by a sound. Soft, shuffling footsteps moving across the floor of the second story. The noise was so faint it might have been a trick of her imagination, but it was enough to make her skin prickle. She lay there staring at the ceiling, listening for any further sounds. When nothing else came, she reluctantly forced herself to sleep. The next morning, she explored the upstairs rooms, finding them covered in dust and cobwebs. The windows were fogged up from years of neglect. Among the forgotten belongings was an old mirror, its glass grimy and cracked. Emma wiped it clean with her sleeve, revealing a tarnished frame and an oddly ornate reflection. As she gazed into the mirror, Emma noticed something peculiar. Her reflection seemed slightly out of sync, as though it was hesitating just a fraction of a second behind her actual movements. She shook off the sensation as fatigue-induced hallucination and continued with her day. By evening, the sky was overcast, and a chill had settled over the house. Emma decided to make herself a hearty dinner, hoping to lift her spirits. As she cooked, she heard the shuffling noises again, but this time they were louder, more insistent. Her heart raced, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing behind her. Determined to shake off her nerves, Emma resolved to investigate. She followed the sound up the creaky stairs, each step echoing in the stillness of the house. The noise seemed to be coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hallway. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling slightly, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for an old, dusty armchair facing the window. Emma stepped inside, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. The air was cold and still, and she could see her breath in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. She examined the room, but found nothing unusual. As she turned to leave, she glanced at the mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her reflection's eyes were wide with terror, and its mouth moved silently as though trying to scream. Emma's heart pounded as she spun around, but the room was still empty. She looked back at the mirror, her reflection now calm, as if nothing had happened. Emma decided to call it a night, her mind racing with unsettling thoughts. As she lay in bed, the shuffling noises continued, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from just beyond the walls. She pulled the covers tightly around herself, trying to block out the sounds. Just before dawn, she was jolted awake by a sudden chill. Her breath misted in the air, and she realized with horror that her entire body was covered in goosebumps. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. Emma sat up in bed, her eyes scanning the darkened room for the source of the noise. It was then she noticed that the hair on her arms and neck was standing on end. The sensation was akin to static electricity, a prickling fear that seemed to emanate from within the walls. She stood up, her legs shaky, and approached the old mirror she had seen earlier. As she drew closer, her reflection appeared distorted, almost like a funhouse mirror, with strange, fluid movements that didn't match her own. Her reflection's face contorted in what looked like a silent scream. Emma's fear escalated into panic. She reached out to touch the mirror, and as her fingers made contact with the cold glass, the reflection's eyes locked onto hers with a piercing intensity. Without warning, the room seemed to spin around her. Emma staggered back, collapsing onto the floor. The whispers turned into frenzied voices, and she could make out fragmented sentences about secrets and warnings. Desperate to escape, she scrambled to her feet and stumbled out of the room. She fled downstairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The front door was right in front of her, but as she reached for the handle, she stopped dead in her tracks. The door was locked. No, it had been bolted shut from the outside. Her heart raced as she turned back, only to see the mirror in the hallway, now ominously clear and unblemished. Her reflection, however, was no longer hers. It was a different face, one she recognized from old family photographs, a long-deceased relative who had vanished without a trace years ago. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The mirror was a gateway, a portal that had trapped the souls of those who dared to confront it. Emma's reflection, her own visage, was now just another imprisoned spirit, forced to watch as she would soon take its place. With one last terrified glance at her own reflection, Emma's hair stood on end for the final time. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was her own face smiling back at her, with a sinister, knowing look. The next morning, the farmhouse appeared undisturbed. The old mirror was gone, and Emma's belongings were neatly packed away. No one ever saw Emma again, but some say if you stand in that house on a stormy night and look into the dusty old mirror hanging in the hallway, you might just see her reflection. Trapped forever, waiting for the next visitor to join her.
Story number 7.
Whispering Door Hinge. The old manor stood abandoned at the edge of town, its grandeur lost to time. Once a symbol of opulence, it was now a crumbling shell, with ivy creeping up its stone walls like fingers of decay. No one ventured near it anymore, except for the occasional thrill-seeker or local legend chaser. It was one such thrill-seeker who found himself on the manor's doorstep one chilly October evening. Marcus Harrington was an amateur investigator of the paranormal, driven by the thrill of the unknown and the lure of proving ghost stories true. His latest fascination was the manor's infamous Whispering Door Hinge, a local legend that claimed the door to the manor's library emitted ghostly whispers at midnight. The manor's exterior was as unwelcoming as the stories surrounding it. Marcus, with a flashlight in one hand and a camera in the other, approached the heavy oak door. The air was dense with foreboding, the night wind whispering secrets through the cracks in the manor's walls. He pushed open the door, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The grand entrance hall was as eerie as he'd imagined. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight, and shadows clung to the corners like dark memories. Marcus made his way through the dimly lit corridors, following the cold draft that seemed to beckon him. His destination, the library. The library was a cavernous room lined with shelves of forgotten books. At its center stood a massive desk, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was heavy, charged with the stillness of neglect. Marcus approached the large oak door leading to the library's inner sanctum, the infamous Whispering Hinge. He set up his equipment with meticulous care, aligning his camera to capture any unusual activity. As the clock struck midnight, Marcus felt a chill race down his spine. The room was enveloped in an unsettling silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the manor settling into the night. The clock's chime was the signal. Marcus watched with bated breath as the old oak door began to move. The door creaked open slowly, the sound amplified in the silent room. The hinge, as the legend foretold, started to whisper. Marcus leaned in, straining to hear the faint murmurs that seemed to float on the edge of perception. At first, the whispers were incoherent, disjointed fragments of sound like a conversation from an ancient dream. But then they began to form words, sentences that chilled Marcus to the bone. "Help us. They are here." The whispers grew more insistent, filled with a sense of urgency and desperation. Marcus's heart raced as he tried to decipher the message. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. He adjusted his camera, capturing the hinge and the door's movement. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The room fell into a deep, oppressive silence. Marcus, unnerved, approached the door to the inner library. As he reached out to open it, a gust of cold air blew through the hall, extinguishing his flashlight. He fumbled in the darkness, his breath forming visible puffs in the freezing air. When he finally managed to relight his flashlight, the door was ajar, and the whispers had returned, more frantic than before. Marcus peered into the darkened library, but it was empty. The room was as still as the rest of the manor. The only sound was the relentless ticking of an old grandfather clock, hidden somewhere in the shadows. Curiosity overcame fear, and Marcus stepped into the library. The room seemed to shift with every step he took, the shadows elongating and contracting in the flickering light. He approached the large desk, drawn to an old journal lying open upon it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with elegant handwriting. The entries were dated back to the manor's early days. They spoke of strange occurrences, sightings of shadowy figures, objects moving on their own, and a growing sense of dread that plagued the manor's occupants. The final entry was the most disturbing. "We are trapped. The door holds our souls. Beware the hinge." Marcus's pulse quickened as he realized the implications. The door was not merely a barrier, it was a prison. The whispers he had heard were the cries of those trapped within the manor, their souls bound by whatever malevolent force had taken hold of it. The grandfather clock's ticking grew louder, almost deafening. Marcus looked up and noticed something horrifying. The shadows in the room were moving, coalescing into vague, human-like shapes. The whispers grew louder, now clearly pleading for release. Panic set in as Marcus realized the danger he was in. He turned to leave, but the library door slammed shut with a resounding bang. He pounded on it, desperate to escape. The whispers had turned into screams, a cacophony of anguish and terror. The shadows swirled around him, closing in. Marcus's flashlight flickered one last time before dying, plunging him into darkness. His breathing was ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the cold, clammy presence of the shadows encroaching upon him. Suddenly, the door creaked open again, and Marcus stumbled out into the hallway, disoriented and terrified. The manor was eerily silent once more, the shadows retreating as if nothing had happened. He fled down the stairs and out of the manor, never looking back. The next morning, Marcus was found unconscious in the manor's entrance hall. He had no recollection of what had happened inside, only that he had been overwhelmed by a sense of dread. The legend of the whispering door hinge grew that night, but the manor was left undisturbed, its dark secrets safe behind its oppressive walls. In the years that followed, the manor remained a place of fear and mystery. The whispers continued to haunt those who dared to listen, but no one ever ventured inside again. The door remained shut, its hinge forever, whispering the secrets of those trapped within. A chilling reminder of the darkness that lay hidden just beyond the threshold.
Story number 8.
Face behind the curtain. Mara had always loved the small, old house she'd inherited from her grandmother. Nestled on the edge of a quaint town, it was a relic of a bygone era, with creaky wooden floors and heavy, ornate curtains that seemed to whisper secrets. But after her grandmother's passing, the house took on a new, unsettling quality. Mara moved in with plans to renovate, but her first night there was anything but restful. She was jolted awake by a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching, like fingernails dragging across fabric. She lay still, heart pounding, listening to the noise which seemed to be coming from the parlor. After a few minutes, the scratching stopped, but Mara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, she inspected the parlor. It was a dimly lit room with a large, heavy curtain that covered an old, glass-paned window. Mara peered behind it and saw nothing unusual. She shrugged off her unease as nerves and decided to get on with the renovation. That night, however, the scratching was louder, more insistent. It was as if something was trying to claw its way out from behind the curtain. Unable to ignore it, Mara tiptoed to the parlor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The scratching continued, each sound sending a shiver down her spine. She yanked the curtain aside and was met with nothing but the empty window and the dark garden outside. She turned the lights on and thoroughly searched the room but found nothing. The scratching stopped, and Mara felt a pang of embarrassment for letting her imagination get the better of her. She returned to bed, but sleep eluded her. Days turned into weeks, and the scratching persisted, growing more frequent and desperate. Each night, Mara found herself drawn to the parlor, convinced something was hidden behind that curtain, but every time she looked, there was nothing. One evening, she decided to confront her fears head-on. She stood in front of the curtain, staring at it as if willing it to reveal its secrets. The scratching began again, and she felt a cold draft brush past her. With trembling hands, she pulled the curtain aside, but the window was still empty. She sighed in frustration and was about to turn away when she noticed something odd. The glass panes of the window seemed unusually foggy, and the outline of the garden was distorted. Mara pressed her face against the glass, trying to peer through, but the fog remained. Just then, the scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, eerie silence. Mara turned, her eyes scanning the room. She felt a strange pressure on her chest, as though the air had become heavier. The silence was broken by a voice, a whisper so soft it was almost inaudible. "Help me." Mara's heart raced. She looked around but saw no one. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me." Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, she approached the window again and saw a figure, pale, almost translucent, pressed against the other side of the glass. The figure's eyes were wide with desperation, and its mouth moved as though trying to speak. Mara recoiled, stumbling back from the window. She turned on all the lights, her breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. The figure was gone, but the room felt colder, and the silence was suffocating. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Mara decided to investigate the history of the house. She visited the local library and dug through old newspapers and records. What she found was both intriguing and horrifying. According to the archives, the house had once belonged to a family named the Harringtons. Their youngest daughter, Eliza, had mysteriously vanished one night. The official story was that she was abducted, but there were rumors of her being trapped in the house, her spirit restless and seeking escape. Mara returned home with a heavy heart. That night, she once again heard the scratching, but this time it was different, more frantic, almost pleading. She felt a growing sense of urgency. She went to the parlor, her hands shaking as she approached the curtain. With a deep breath, she pulled it aside, but the figure was not there. Instead, she noticed a small, rusty latch on the bottom of the window frame, something she hadn't seen before. Her curiosity piqued. Mara unlatched it and pushed the window open. The air was frigid, and Mara felt a draft sweeping through the room. She shined a flashlight outside and was startled to find a small, hidden compartment built into the wall beneath the window. Inside was a small, dusty box. With trembling hands, she opened it, revealing a collection of old, faded photographs and a diary. The diary belonged to Eliza Harrington. It detailed her growing despair and fear as she realized she was trapped in the house. Her last entry was a desperate plea for someone to find her and release her from her confinement. As Mara read the final, heart-wrenching words, she felt a presence behind her. Turning slowly, she saw the figure again, but this time it was not pressed against the glass. It was standing in the room, its form becoming more solid. It was Eliza, her face a mix of sadness and relief. Eliza's ghost reached out, and Mara felt a wave of sorrow and gratitude wash over her. With a soft, whispering farewell, Eliza's figure began to fade, leaving behind a profound silence. The scratching had stopped, and the room felt lighter. Mara knew she had fulfilled the final wish of a lost soul. The house, once a prison, now felt like a sanctuary. As she looked out the window, the night seemed less oppressive, and for the first time since moving in, she felt at peace. But as she turned away, a final twist made her heart skip a beat. The last photograph in the box showed a family portrait of the Harringtons. Mara noticed something chilling. The reflection in the window behind them was not of their home, but of the very parlor she stood in. And in that reflection, she saw herself, looking out at the world with a shadowy figure standing just behind her, its face hidden behind a curtain.
Story number 9.
Distant cry nears. The night was still, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every sound feel magnified. In the small, forgotten town of Evermore, this stillness was almost comforting to Lydia. After a long drive, she was relieved to have arrived at her aunt's old cottage, an isolated relic perched on a hill surrounded by dense, gnarled trees. The place had been left to her after her aunt's death, and though Lydia had never been close to her, she felt a strange pull to explore the old house. The cottage looked even more forlorn than she remembered from childhood visits. Its dark windows, chipped paint, and overgrown yard seemed to absorb the moonlight, making it hard to tell where the shadows ended and the darkness began. Lydia tried to shake off her unease as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust danced in the air, illuminated by the beam of her flashlight. She set her suitcase down and began to unpack, the eerie silence occasionally interrupted by the creak of the old wooden floors. As Lydia explored the dimly lit rooms, she found old family photographs and relics of a bygone era. One photo in particular caught her eye, a portrait of her aunt as a young woman, standing in front of the cottage. There was something unsettling about the expression on her aunt's face, a shadow in her eyes that seemed almost aware of Lydia's presence. Later that night, as Lydia settled into the bedroom, she heard it, a distant cry. It was a sound she couldn't quite place, a mix of anguish and desperation that seemed to seep through the walls. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind or perhaps the old house settling, but the cry persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Unable to sleep, Lydia decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. The moon was high, casting long, eerie shadows among the trees. The sound seemed to be coming from the edge of the forest. With each step, the cry grew clearer, more distinct and more terrifying. It was as if someone or something was calling out for help, but in a way that chilled Lydia to the core. The trees loomed tall and menacing as she pushed through the underbrush. The cry now felt unnervingly close, and Lydia's heart raced. She reached a small clearing where the moonlight illuminated a crumbling stone well. The cries were louder now, seemingly emanating from the well itself. Lydia approached cautiously, peering over the edge into the darkness below. The well was deep and empty, the cries echoing off the stone walls, creating a haunting melody that twisted Lydia's insides. As she leaned in further, she heard a soft rustling behind her. She spun around, her flashlight revealing nothing but the forest's dark, looming presence. The cries seemed to be coming from all around her now, an impossible cacophony that defied spatial logic. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees, stumbling toward her. It was a woman, her face gaunt and eyes hollow, her clothes tattered. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as the woman reached out with trembling hands. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a raspy echo of the cries Lydia had been hearing. Lydia took a step back, her mind racing. The woman's gaze was intense, almost as if she were trying to convey something through her desperate eyes. Then, without warning, the woman collapsed, her body crumpling to the ground. Lydia hesitated, torn between fear and the need to help. She approached the woman, but as she reached out to check for a pulse, the figure vanished, dissolving into the night as if it had never been there. The cries ceased abruptly, leaving Lydia in a deafening silence. Her heart pounded as she made her way back to the cottage, her mind reeling. What had she just witnessed? Was it real, or a figment of her imagination? The night felt colder, the shadows deeper, as if the forest itself had become a living entity closing in around her. Inside the cottage, Lydia tried to calm her racing thoughts. She reviewed the family photos again, searching for any clue that might explain the strange events. In a faded, dusty frame, she found an old newspaper clipping detailing her aunt's life. It was then that Lydia noticed a peculiar detail: the date of the article. It matched the date of the mysterious woman's appearance. The article spoke of a local legend, an ancient curse associated with the cottage and the surrounding land. It was said that those who disturbed the resting place of a long-dead family would be haunted by the spirits seeking release from their eternal torment. Lydia's aunt had apparently been researching this very legend before her death. Lydia's blood ran cold as she connected the dots. The cries, the apparition, it was all connected to the curse. Her aunt's research had led her to uncovering something dangerous, and now Lydia had become part of that story. The spirits were not just haunting the land, they were calling out for someone to understand their plight, to acknowledge their suffering. The realization hit Lydia with a wave of dread. She had unwittingly become the next link in a tragic chain of events. The curse was not something she could simply escape. The cries had been a desperate plea, a warning of what awaited those who came too close. The next morning, Lydia left the cottage and the town behind, but the cries of the lost souls followed her, echoing in her mind. Evermore was no longer just a place on a map. It was a reminder of the dark history she had uncovered. And as she drove away, she knew that the distant cry of anguish would never truly fade. It would always be near, lurking in the shadows of her thoughts.
Story number 10.
Wet footprints follow. The night was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the rain pattering against the windows and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Elaine paced the small cabin's wooden floor, her eyes darting nervously toward the front door. The storm outside had grown violent, leaving her stranded in this isolated retreat with no way to contact the outside world. Elaine had rented the cabin to escape the chaos of her life, seeking solace and solitude. The remote location, deep in the forested mountains, was supposed to offer peace. Instead, it had delivered an unsettling quiet, broken only by the incessant storm and the strange, unsettling sounds she'd begun to notice. She had first heard them that afternoon, a series of soft thuds coming from the cabin's back porch. Dismissing them as the result of the wind or perhaps a stray animal, Elaine tried to ignore the sounds. But as darkness fell and the storm intensified, the noises grew more persistent. Now it sounded like footsteps, wet, heavy, and unnervingly close. Elaine tried to distract herself by reading a book, but her focus was shattered each time she heard those footfalls. The sense of being watched gnawed at her, making her skin crawl. Every time she checked the windows, she saw nothing but the relentless rain and shadows. Then came the first real sign of something being amiss. A set of wet footprints leading from the back porch to the front door. The cabin's wooden floors, previously dry and warm, now seemed to absorb the water from the tracks, leaving a dark, eerie trail. Elaine's heart raced as she traced the footprints with trembling fingers, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that might have left them. Desperate to calm her nerves, Elaine grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. She sighed in frustration, feeling trapped not just by the storm, but by her own growing sense of dread. Just then, she heard a loud bang from the back of the cabin. The noise was followed by a scratching sound, as though something was trying to claw its way inside. Elaine's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. She considered the possibility of a burglar or someone trying to break in, but the thought that kept her awake was something far more sinister. She shivered, trying to muster the courage to investigate the noise. When she finally stepped outside into the storm, her flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness. The footprints were still there, leading to the edge of the forest. Elaine hesitated, her breath visible in the cold, damp air. The forest was blacker than pitch, the trees standing like silent sentinels. She knew she should go back inside, but the need to understand what was happening pushed her forward. As she followed the trail, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling through the trees. The footprints were clear, but they led to a point where they abruptly ended. Elaine scanned the area, her flashlight beam dancing through the dark, wet foliage. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Then she saw it. A figure standing among the trees. It was obscured by the darkness, but Elaine could make out a silhouette, a person, or perhaps something more. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to call out, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. The figure remained motionless, staring at her. Elaine's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She slowly backed away, keeping her eyes fixed on the figure. Just as she turned to flee, she stumbled over something soft and wet. She looked down and gasped. The ground was covered in small, dark shapes that looked like human fingers. Panicking, she raced back to the cabin, slamming the door behind her and locking it tight. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof was now accompanied by a steady, rhythmic tapping at the windows. Elaine tried to tell herself it was just the storm, but the persistent tapping felt deliberate, almost mocking. She glanced at the fireplace, which was now her only source of light and warmth. The flames flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the room. The tapping grew louder, and Elaine could no longer ignore the growing sense of impending doom. In a fit of desperation, Elaine grabbed a flashlight and a heavy wooden broom, preparing to defend herself against whatever might come. She tiptoed toward the window, her eyes wide with fear. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Elaine's heart raced as she fumbled for the flashlight. She turned it on, the beam cutting through the blackness, but the sight it revealed made her blood run cold. The wet footprints had returned, but this time they were inside the cabin. They led from the door to the fireplace, where a figure now stood, backlit by the dying flames. Elaine's hand shook as she shone the flashlight on the figure. To her horror, it was a perfect replica of herself, dripping wet and eerily still. Her doppelganger turned slowly, a twisted smile playing on its lips. Elaine staggered backward, her mind reeling. She knew she had to escape, but the way out was blocked by the shadowy, dripping figure. Desperate, Elaine grabbed the broom and lunged at the doppelganger. The figure dissipated into a cloud of mist, leaving behind only a chilling laugh that echoed through the cabin. The wet footprints remained, leading to the door. With shaking hands, Elaine opened it, hoping to escape. Outside, the storm had ceased. The forest was quiet, and the footprints led to a small, serene pond she hadn't noticed before. She followed them to the water's edge and saw something that made her gasp. The pond was filled with dozens of wet, dark shapes, human fingers just like those she had seen earlier. A chilling realization hit her. The doppelganger wasn't a separate entity, but a reflection of the fear and despair she had harbored. The pond was a mirror of her own troubled mind, manifesting her deepest fears. Elaine took one last shivering look at the pond, then turned away, determined to leave the cabin behind. As she walked back toward the road, the storm had finally cleared, revealing a calm, moonlit sky. The footprints had vanished, but the haunting memory of that night would follow her long after she left the cabin. The forest remained silent as Elaine drove away, leaving the wet footprints and the eerie doppelganger behind. But the experience had left her with a lingering question. Was the terror truly over, or was it only the beginning of a deeper, more personal nightmare?